And will you pray with me once more? Father, as we open your word together, Lord, we pray that you, by your Spirit, would lead us into truth. Father, that you would help us to examine our own hearts and to understand what these parables have to say to us. Lord, that we would do that before we consider our neighbor and how these parables may address them. And Father, that you would be glorified in the preaching of your word and that your people would be helped. Father, I pray for the visitors among us, Lord, that as they hear the word, Lord, they would hear word rightly divided and finding it truth, Lord. These things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Let me tell you a story that goes back a little ways to the final event in my college career. I had spent 3 years at what is now Tyndale, but then was OBC, and I was a commuter student. And if you're a commuter student, you drive back and forth all the time, and you never really build too much friendships with the people. I mean, you knew people in class, but you didn't really feel part. But I had purchased for myself and my brand new fiance, 19 years old as she was at the time, 2 tickets for the graduation banquet, which was to be held at the Weston Harbor Castle in downtown Toronto. We were looking forward to the evening, but this is the late 90s, the earliest days of the internet, when if the GPS existed, they only belonged to really rich people and everybody else worked with paper maps. In fact, if you remember those days, you know, paper maps were great for navigating highways, but when it came to actually finding some place in downtown Toronto, usually your tickets would come, and they'd have a little map drawn on there, and there'd be 2 or 3 instructions of how to get to where you were going. You really young people have no idea what I'm talking about. But this is what we had, a little map on our tickets. It was very small, and we're trying to work our way, small town boy, riding through downtown Toronto, and we drove past the Harbor Castle, and you can see it right there, but where are you supposed to park your car? It's right downtown Toronto. So finally, we found parking and had to walk a number of blocks to reach the site of the banquet. And by the time we got there, we were actually late, and everybody had found their seat. And I will admit, I was disappointed. We ended up sitting at a table of misfits at the very back of the banquet hall without a very good view of the platform, where the brand new president of the school was supposed to speak. They had elected a new president that year, a guy named Brian C. Stiller. And if that name kind of rings a bell for some of you, he was the president of the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada at the time. And I was kind of excited to hear this new president speak. And here I am, stuck with a bunch of misfits at the very back of the auditorium without a clear view. The only redeeming fact was that they had held up services or the beginning of the meal because they were waiting for a couple people, apparently not Michelle and I, because they did not begin as soon as we sat down. We took 2 of the last 4 seats left. And a few minutes later, after we had taken our seats at a table furthest from the front, the brand new president of the college and seminary hurried in with his wife, and looking around, found that the only seats left in the entire auditorium were at a table of misfits, as far from the stage as possible. And so, lo and behold, even though I showed up late and had to sit at the very back of the hall, the guy that sat down immediately next to me was Brian C. Stiller and his wife. And so it was that the last table became the first table, and rather than being seated in obscurity, I was seated next to the new president with all the glory that comes with that. I want to look at these parables that Jesus tells to the Pharisees and examine a little bit what they mean. Now, a parable, as most of you know, is not just a story. It's not just a moral story or an ethical story. It's a story that is intended to present something that is sometimes startling or surprising, a spiritual truth. And here's the context. We are sitting in the dining room of the chief Pharisee where Jesus has been invited to a trap, or maybe a dinner. When he arrives, he immediately encounters a man with dropsy, a man with an insatiable thirst, a man that we wouldn't expect to be in the dining room of the chief Pharisee. And Jesus knows that they're all watching him. By the way, it's the Sabbath day. And they're watching to see what Jesus would do. And of course, Jesus does what we would expect him to do. He heals the man and sends him away. And then he has a few words of rebuke for the Pharisees, correcting the way that they viewed the Sabbath day. He said to them, "Which of you, if your son fell into a well on the Sabbath day, would not pull him out until the next day? Or even if an ox fell into a well, would wait until the next day to pull him out?" And so justified the work he had done. Now, we know from last week that Jesus was being watched closely at this meal, but I want you to notice that Jesus is returning the favor because he's watching the Pharisees just as closely. And what he notices is after he's healed this man and sent him away, and it's time to sit down to dinner, it's like musical chairs. Do you remember musical chairs? When one got pulled away and everybody's just scrambling to get into the seat, and all of the Pharisees are kind of scrambling to get into the seats of honor. And so let's consider the text here in verse 7. Now he told a parable to those who were invited when he noticed how they chose the places of honor, saying to them, "When you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in a place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you be invited by him. And he who invited you both will come and say to you, 'Give your place to this person,' and then you will begin with shame to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit in the lowest place, so that when your host comes in, he may say to you, 'Friend, move up higher.' And then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at table with you. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." I want you to notice, first of all, that Luke tells us that he tells them a parable. So this is a story, and this story has some logical truth to it. But because it's a parable, it's also teaching us a spiritual truth. But let's talk about the logical truth. If you find yourself invited to a wedding, and that wedding you go in and there's no set seating plan, and so you get there early. You decide that you don't want to go to cocktail hour because you're a good Baptist and you don't go to cocktail hour. Or maybe you just think the room is air conditioned and outside is hot and sweaty. For whatever reason, you've come in early. And the whole place is open. All the seats are available. They've set for 100, and you can see where the head table is. Where are you going to sit? Where are you going to sit? Are you going to go and say, "Look, this is the seat that is closest to the point of glory. This is where the bride and groom will sit. I'm going to sit right here, front and center." And you're so excited because you got there early. There's nobody else there. And you sit there kind of smugly and happily watching as people come in and they slowly fill in. And of course, the place kind of fills from the front first. It's not like church where it fills from the back first. You got to come early for those back row seats. But it's filled right up, and there's only a few seats left. There's that table of misfits that's always at the wedding. You know, the guy that's got a 3-day beard wearing a powder blue tuxedo from the 70s. And the woman who thought it would be a great idea to wear like a white gown to a wedding, but she's not the bride. You're like, I'm glad I'm not sitting back with those people. And the MC says, we're about to announce the coming of the bride and groom. Everybody's excited. You think, boy, oh boy, I'm glad I came early, because here I am sitting in front of everybody as close to the point of glory as I could ever be. And just then an usher taps you on the shoulder and says, I'm sorry, but the mother of the bride has just arrived, and we need this seat for her. And there in front of everybody, you have to stand up and gather your belongings and shuffle your way all the way back to the misfit table with the girl in the white gown and the guy in the blue tuxedo. You understand? You can feel it, right? I mean, that's the kind of stuff of nightmares. That's the kind of stuff where you're ashamed. And I mean, everybody's looking at you and they know what's happened. You just got devalued in front of the entire crowd and sat down. Jesus said, wouldn't it have been better if you came in, finding the whole place empty, you're there early, and you just sit down at the back table? And wouldn't it be so much better if while you're sitting at the table, once the bride and groom have come in and taken their seats, you see the bride and groom put their heads together and say something to the usher, and the usher comes back to you and says, hey, you shouldn't be sitting way back here. We'd love to have you sit closer because we want to see you. And there, he says, you're honored. And everybody looks and sees what an honor this is. Now, this is not a story about how to get honor. We would read this wrongly if we read this story and say, Jesus is telling us how to be honored. This is how you're able to get more glory for yourself. That's not what Jesus' point is. Anyone who takes this story to heart in that way and says, okay, so if I want the best seat in the house, I need to take the worst seat in the house. And if I take the worst seat in the house, then surely I will be given the best seat in the house. Jesus even says, you may be promoted to a better seat. But he's not saying this is automatically the way to do it. In fact, I think Jesus would have something to say to you if you walked in to the banquet hall and you were working out in your mind how to get the best seat, because it's no better than taking the best seat if what you really want is the best seat. Both are acting out of a motivation of pride, and the heart of this parable is verse 11, where Jesus says, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled. Right? Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. So even if in your heart you are exalting yourself, because this is a spiritual truth, and you're not doing it in a way that anybody else can see, still the Lord sees that. So you take the lowest seat, and the Lord might just say, well, you can keep the lowest seat right now, because what your motivation is pride. This is a reality of our human condition. This is the natural way in which we're born. This is part of our sin nature. We are marked by pride. It doesn't always manifest itself by taking the best seat. It might show up when we claim to have been treated unfairly. Generally, that claim, that was not fair. It's not fair. I shouldn't be treated this way, is a claim of pride that says something is owed to me. I deserve better than this. Pride sometimes shows itself when we're going through the grocery store checkout line and the sign clearly says 12 items only, and we've got 15 items, but 2 of them are the same thing, and we're kind of justifying that it's okay for me to be in this line, but the person in front of you in line has got 16 items, and they're clearly not the same thing, and in your mind you're condemning them and saying, they should not be in this line, I'm in a hurry. Right? This is pride. This is pride that is working itself out. This is what happens when you get to the airport and you put 2 bags on the seats on either side of you so nobody else can sit there and say, I deserve 3 seats because I don't want to sit beside the person that forgot to put on deodorant and smells like fried onions. That's pride. I cannot imagine Jesus would sit down in an airport and take 3 seats. I just don't think it would happen. And by the way, if you didn't get there early enough to claim 3 seats with your bags, you're the person that shows up and has that disapproving look on your face, but you still know that if you'd gotten there first, you would have taken 3 seats. Pride is a serious condition. And I want to say this, again, this teaching of Jesus is not an instruction on how to be exalted, but rather this is a teaching which finds its whole message in the aim of humility. How do I think of myself? How is my status before God? Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees, to the chief Pharisees, to the people who considered themselves the most righteous representatives in all of Israel. And he says it's very easy to look down on other people and say, I'm more righteous than everybody else. I deserve to sit a little bit closer to the heavenly seat than anybody else. And Jesus says, as you rightly understand yourself, you will come to understand that simply to be invited to a place at the table at all is a tremendous honor. And so don't concern yourself with how close you're sitting to the front. Rather come in and sit down and give thanks that you're here. So Jesus tells this story, and in doing so kind of shames all of those musical chair Pharisees who are just trying to pile into the best seats. But he doesn't spare the host either, because the second parable, a parable about prejudice, is spoken now to the host. Jesus lives in a culture that had 2 major aspects to it. One aspect was the aspect of patronage. You were either the very top of the pile, which means you were a patron, which meant you had some social capital to give. You could bestow your favor on certain people, and people were clamoring for your favor. Or you were a little bit lower down the ladder, and you were looking for patronage. You were looking for somebody who was going to give to you honor. One commentator says this: where one sat or was assigned or allowed to sit at a meal vis-a-vis the host, in relation to the host, was a public advertisement of one's status. So this is a way of advertising how important you are. And so patronage was a big part, but the other part of Jesus' culture was the idea of reciprocation. That if you received something from me, that you would also give something to me. So Chase, if I'm inviting you to a great barbecue, and we're going to barbecue really thick steaks, and Chase goes, this is great. I'm excited about that. I like a thick steak. There's some expectation that sometime in the near future, Chase is going to invite me to his place for a nice pile of seafood. So powerful is this obligation that one who knew they couldn't reciprocate or pay back would actually have to decline an invitation. It would be bad form to accept an invitation that you couldn't return. So to invite someone who wasn't in your social class was a way of shaming them because they would be forced to decline and so announce to everybody else that they knew they weren't worth as much as the other guests. So listen to what Jesus says here in verse 12. He said also to the man who had invited him, when you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. Again, this is a parable, has some spiritual truth to it. What we know that Jesus is not suggesting, think about this for a minute. Jesus is not suggesting that it is always wrong when you have a feast or a dinner or a wedding, that it's always wrong to invite your friends or your relatives. That's not what Jesus is trying to teach here. If that's what Jesus is trying to teach, Jesus would have some answering to do for the feast in the upper room when he is the host and he invites all of his disciples. So we see that Jesus is not saying don't ever have a feast or a banquet where you invite your friends. Rather, what Jesus is talking about is the claim to be generous or to be altruistic. How does that work? Look at me. Look at how generous I am. Look at how open-hearted I am. Look, I'm putting on this feast, and it cost an awful lot of money, and I've invited all of these people to eat with me. What a great man I am. And Jesus says, if, while you're claiming to be a great man or a great woman, because you've given this feast and invited all these people in, if everybody sitting around there is related to you or is well-to-do, is your neighbor, and is expected to invite you back so that you can get the same. If this was part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus would say, you've received your reward in full. There's no reward coming. There's no particular blessing for this kind of generosity, as if you've done something that is commendable. You've done what everybody does. And there's nothing wrong with inviting your friends or your family to have dinner with you. Just don't do it and then wave around, the banner that says, I'm a really nice person because I invited these people. Jesus says, if in fact what you want to do is something meritorious, if you want to give something rather than gain something, if you want to be truly generous, invite those who can never repay you to the feast. Now this is quite shocking for Jesus' people to hear. He lists the very people that the chief Pharisee would never invite. In fact, at the same time as Jesus is alive, there's a particular group of people called the Essenes. We never hear about them in the Bible, but history tells us this particular sect of Jews existed, and they were probably even more strict than the Pharisees, but they're kind of related to the Pharisees. They had a strict code of honor for how you conducted yourself. They lived in commune together, and one of the things that they have in their list of rules is the fact that the poor, the lame, the crippled, and the blind, the very four groups that Jesus mentions, that these people are under the curse of God, that the reason that they're poor, that they're lame, that they're crippled or blind is because God has judged them and found them lacking. They're getting what they deserve. And so we don't do anything for those people. In fact, the crippled, the blind, and the lame in Jesus' day were not permitted to enter the temple and give sacrifice. They were considered unclean people. And so this is a really shocking thing that Jesus says. When you have a feast, invite the people that nobody would invite. Invite the social outcasts. Invite the people that everybody else in your group says those people get what they deserve. Leave them alone. So let me say just a couple things in application. First of all, important to hear this, it is not sin when your daughter gets married to invite your family to attend the wedding feast, or when you're having Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter, festival, dinner, to invite people you like and people you know. But I think we need to at least take this at face value enough to say, are there people in your sphere, in your neighborhood, who you never invite, who you might invite, and who it might actually seem revolutionary to the world? They might look and go, that's weird. That's weird that they invited him. Do you have a neighbor that lives alone? Do you have somebody that shambles along on your street and picks tin cans out of your recycling and everybody else is recycling at 5 o'clock in the morning when nobody can see them? I wonder what would happen if you sometimes said, hey, why don't you come for dinner? I think it would be wrong for us to read this text and say, no, that's not what it means. I think the most literal reading is often the right reading. This was a problem in the church in the early days. James writes a letter to the church, and he chastises the church for holding a double standard. The church was welcoming in the wealthy and powerful and saying, look, here's a seat of honor. It's got cushions on it. You can sit there, But to the person that was coming in that was on ODSP, they were like, just sit anywhere, whatever. And James says to them, you've become judges with evil thoughts. You are picking and choosing who you will honor. I wonder if God sees them the same way. Paul takes the Corinthian church to task for having love feasts, aka potluck dinners, where the poor are put to shame because they didn't have the distinction of enjoying the same dishes as the rich. The wealthy had brought nice dishes that had meat in them, like sausages at the potluck. And the poor had brought macaroni and cheese or just sauerkraut. And they said, hey, you poor people, don't eat the meat, but you rich people have whatever you like. Paul takes them to task for that. Where do we find application in our own lives? Well, I want to say this. This is an interesting fact. Consider this. In our world cultures, Jesus' culture sounds different than ours. The Greco-Roman culture in which Jesus is teaching, where there's these distinct class distinctions, and this person would never even think of being seen with this person. In our culture, those people are standing in line together at the express checkout line in the grocery store. That's true, right? I mean, when you go to the Food Basics parking lot or the Sobeys parking lot or wherever you go, there are rusty cars parked beside BMWs in the parking lot. And you go, so this is a slightly different culture, because in Jesus' culture, very clearly, the very well-to-do had nothing to do with the poor. And this is interesting to think about for a moment, because there are places in the world today. My wife lived for a time in the Middle East, and in the Middle East, even as a mostly grown-up person, if she wanted to go to the corner store, she wasn't permitted to just walk down to the corner store. She had to go get the little neighbor boy, even though he was 4 years old, so that he could lead the way, because no woman, and she was in a fairly moderate place in the Middle East, but no woman was allowed to simply go unescorted through the streets. You had to have a male lead you through the streets, and that male had to walk in front of you, not beside you. So here, 16 years old, you got a little 4-year-old leading the way to the grocery store so you can go shopping. And you go, hey, this culture is different than ours, where women are devalued and men, even if they're 4 years old, are considered of higher value. There are places in the world today where you can go where there is still a caste system, where the idea of karma and reincarnation is so strongly held that people literally think it's wrong to help the poor because the poor have got what they deserve because they must have done something in their last life and been reincarnated at this lowly state, and they have to work out their way, and we're not going to help them. And so it's an interesting thing to think about in places and cultures where Christianity has had some deep penetration over the centuries, to see how much we have changed, how our views have changed about value of people. And that's true, but before we think that it's a feather in our cap that we don't have a caste system and that we don't think of women as less valuable than men, I do want to challenge the whole congregation on this. Are we not tempted to think it's a point of honor to have a politician or a doctor or a well-known person like a writer or an artist or a celebrity in the church, and we think to ourselves, hey, we got doctors come to our church, you know. But we don't think as highly of a single mom or an elderly widow or a person who has to live on disability support. Does God see it the same way? Does God look and go, wow, Walsh Baptist Church, you know, politicians visit that place? Or does he look and see the elderly widow as just as valuable? Jesus is challenging how we think about people and saying, think about people as God thinks about people, not as the world thinks about people. And don't be afraid or ashamed to invite the person that nobody else would invite to share your table with you. Jesus does it all the time. I want to finish by just looking at this third point, which is not a parable, it's just the conclusion of this one. It's here in verse 14, where Jesus says, but when you give a feast, invite the poor, crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. Here's an important truth. Jesus promises that there is reward for those who show kindness to the least of these. But you see, when the investment comes due, in our current banking system, we have GICs, guaranteed investment certificates. They aren't necessarily the highest paying investment vehicles, but they're guaranteed. If you invest in this particular guaranteed investment certificate, you are guaranteed to receive the interest that's promised. So if you happen to buy one that's fairly long, say you buy a 10-year GIC, and it promises it's going to return 5%, which I think would be pretty good. And we show up in the middle of year 8 and expect to receive the promised amount, and you would say, well, you've come too early. The promised amount is paid when the certificate matures. And Jesus is promising far higher yield than anything you can get in a GIC. But I often see people complain that they've made a spiritual investment and they didn't get the reward they expected. I taught Sunday school for years. Do you know how many years I missed service and I spent time with ankle biters in the basement? I gave faithfully to the church. I gave a high percentage. I mean, if you looked at the amount that people gave, I gave more than most people to the church. I've invested